Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think we'll get underway. My name is Robert McKay, and I'm a member of the Toronto branch of the Anthroposophical Society. You're in for a real treat tonight. I've heard Professor Amrine lecture on a number of occasions, and it's always a real delight. Before we do an introduction to Fred, I want to just say a few things about the lecture series as a whole. Spiritual Awakening in a Scientific Age. There will be 3 lectures. Tonight's the first, one in October and one in November, all with the focus of introducing the work of Rudolf Steiner and Anthroposophy from various perspectives. And it may be worth comment that somebody who passed away in 1925 still requires introduction. But I think that will be the case for some time. Steiner's ideas are so innovative and so much in the leading edge of where our culture may be able to go that it takes quite a bit of time for these ideas to be assimilated. So far, our culture, and I'm speaking very broadly in terms of culture here, has largely walked around anthroposophy, not really engaging with it, essentially dismissing it. And I think that that's in the process of changing, thanks to the hard work of people like Professor Amrine and others. And I think that this is of great need. I think that our culture, without the resources of anthroposophy, is going to get in increasingly difficult troubles. That we need actually to grow beyond the scientific method, which right now is really a sacred cow of our society. Not that there's anything wrong with it insofar as it exists, but there are deeper ways of knowing which humanity needs to develop. And I hope that you'll find some initial seeds and thoughts in that direction from Professor Amrine's lecture. I'll ask Grant to come up and introduce him. Thank you for coming.
Dr. Amrine asked me to keep it short and informal and modest. Knowing what I do about Dr. Amrine, that would be difficult, so I will try to stick to the script. Fred Amrine is the Arthur F. Thurno Professor in German Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Among other things, he is the Goethe Scholar at the university. He has 2 books on Goethe forthcoming, a book on 2 Wilhelm Meister novels with Cambridge University Press that should be out in January, and a collection of his many pieces on Goethe's scientific work forthcoming from Adonis Press. Altogether, he's published more than 100 books. This is a man whose first book, when he was a grad student, had the preface from Saul Bellow, right. So that's a pretty prestigious start to a career. Now, having published more than 100 books, many of these are translations and editions of the work of Rudolf Steiner, and they're available from Amazon under the imprint Carix. He has, he claims immodestly, certainly I'm impressed, made a list, and it's on the book table of these anthroposophical publications. What impressed me at dinner tonight was the fact that he's halfway through the 8-volume Karmic Relationships, a new translation. That really caught my attention. There's one customer standing right here. He's also interested in a wide range of other topics, including German Romanticism, German idealism, aesthetics, the history of science, and art history. Professor Amrine has been an anthroposophist in his entire adult life, so he is, he claims, quite an expert. I think that's probably the understatement of the night. Quite an expert on Rudolf Steiner. An especially interesting chapter of this larger saga is Steiner's work as an architectural theorist and practitioner, together with its reception. That is the topic of tonight's talk. I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Amrine.
Thanks very much. Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for turning out. I've been asked to say a few words by way of general introduction to Rudolf Steiner, and I'm certainly glad to do that. Exactly 1 week ago, so last Thursday morning, I was giving another talk at the local Waldorf school because last Thursday, as many of you know, was the 100th anniversary of Waldorf education. So this is the part of Rudolf Steiner's work that's best known. The Waldorf movement has grown to become, I think, the second largest independent school movement in the world after Montessori. And the remarkable thing about this is that when most cultural initiatives get to be 100 years old, they've pretty much petered out. They've lost all their vitality, ready for the museum, but this is certainly not the case with Waldorf education. In fact, one gets the feeling that it's very young and that it's still building up its head of steam, right? So we can look forward to the Waldorf movement expanding for many years to come. The Waldorf School was, I always think this is very ironic. It was founded by Emil Molt and his wife, Bertha. And Emil Molt was the owner of the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory, right? And thus the name of Waldorf education. He went to Steiner and asked him to found a school for his workers, right? Waldorf education began, like Montessori, as a workers' movement, right? Unfortunately, no longer the case. But of course, it's very ironic that it was founded on cigarette money, right? I think at this point, the second leading area in which Steiner is well known is biodynamics. Biodynamics is a form of organic agriculture. It was inaugurated by Rudolf Steiner a very long time ago in 1923. And it's grown to become, especially in Europe, but not just in Europe, a really enormous movement. Again, I think it's somewhat ironic that above all, it's biodynamic wine that has captured the public's consciousness, let's say. And these biodynamic wines win almost every competition now, almost every prize. In fact, I have a story to tell you about that. So my wife and I were up, not this summer, last summer, in northern Vermont, up near Burlington. We went to an upscale little wine store and went in, and we thought, well, maybe they'll have a bottle or two or biodynamic wine. And so we asked the owner, who was a real aficionado, right, really knew wine really well. And he said, we said, well, do you have any biodynamic wine? He said, they're all biodynamic, and which blew us away. He said, many of them can't get the label because it's required. But basically, everybody's using these techniques now. And that's astonishing, right? So Hauschka cosmetics are very highly regarded, right? Some people think they're the finest cosmetics in the world. So Anthroposophy is most famous for cigarettes, wine, and cosmetics. I'm sure that Steiner is turning in his grave somewhere. Yeah, it's one of those funny historical ironies. The other field in which really got a boost recently, for a reason I'll tell you in a moment, is the other part of Steiner's social theory. The Waldorf School was meant to be part of a larger social construct called the threefold social order. And in general, social finance is a field in which anthroposophists now have many decades of successful work. There's the American institution, which is most famous for this, used to be called the Rudolf Steiner Foundation, and now they call themselves RSF Social Finance. And they're very, very high profile nonprofit in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And just about everybody knows them. And this is a so-called anthroposophical bank. And it's very different from your normal bank because it's not at all driven by profit motive. It's much rather a way, let's say, a sane and social way of distributing capital. And I wish I could talk a lot about that. I can't. But the other side of social finance and of the threefold movement that's really grown up from the grassroots and become a tremendous impulse is the so-called CSA movement. CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. Now, I think there are probably several CSAs in Greater Toronto, right? The CSA, the thought behind it is that the farmers are taken out of, they're relieved of the risk of farming, right? So a group of people who want to belong to the farm go to an annual meeting at the beginning of the year, which can be a lot of fun because you get to fight about what's going to get grown. So they get to say what will get grown. And then a living wage is built into the budget for the farmers, right, which is guaranteed. And then it's divided by the number of people who want to participate, the so-called shareholders. And then you get a figure per share, right? In 19, let's say 86, there was precisely one CSA in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So this is a fairly small university town. With all the students there, it's a little more than 150,000. There was only one, and it was the biodynamic CSA and so forth. Today, there are 50 CSAs in Ann Arbor, just in Ann Arbor, right? So this is something that has exploded, just exploded. Well, that's all I want to say as a general introduction to Rudolf Steiner. And actually, my lecture tonight is about something very specific. It's about Steiner as an expressionist architect. Now, there are a number of reasons why this is a fascinating topic. But I thought the reason that was especially germane for this venue, right, was that it's an area in which Steiner has, apart from a number of sometimes notable insiders, Steiner has been ignored until fairly recently. And the reasons for that are complex and interesting. But in the last couple of decades, Steiner has started to be accorded real respect as an architect, and maybe even is seen as one of the great architects. So I want to tell that story tonight. And it's interesting in itself, but it's also an example, right? It's an example that I could have multiplied in any number of different arenas of the ways in which Steiner has gone, well, this is a little too brutal, but from obscurity to some sort of fame, right? Okay, so Rudolf Steiner as an expressionist architect. I'm going to stand over here out of everyone's way. So this is Rudolf Steiner. His dates are 1861 to 1925. He built 17 buildings. Now, this is already unusual for an expressionist architect because mostly they couldn't get their commissions built, right? It was very much a paper phenomenon with only a few buildings actually built. The most important of the first Goethe Annum, now, it wasn't known as the first Goethe Annum. We call it the first Goethe Annum because it was destroyed by fire, right? And of course, Steiner didn't know that would happen. And then the second Goethe Annum was built on the foundations of the first, right? So we distinguish between the first and the second Goethe Annum in a way that Steiner didn't. The Goethe Annum stands in the middle of Dornach. Dornach was a tiny little town. It's now the farthest most suburb of Basel. And in fact, you can reach it on the tram line. He built a number of other buildings there and created a kind of utopian community in which architecture figures very strongly. Now, he also was an important, sorry, can you still hear me? An important architectural theorist. And he gave more than 70 lectures on architecture, collected in 5 volumes, many of which I've translated. CW 286, 287, 288, 289, and 290. 286 is one that I didn't translate. It's published by Rudolf Steiner Press, Architecture as a Synthesis of the Arts. So, let's establish some expressionist principles, right? These are general expressionist principles, and we'll want to look for these in Steiner's architecture. The first is transformation and transcendence, right? So it's an architecture that actually tries to transcend its physicality. Rejection of historical forms, needless to say, so it's not neo-Gothic or neo-Greek or neo-Baroque or anything like that. It's in something that's entirely new, right? Rejection of historical forms. Representation of inner states and unconscious forces. Now, this is, of course, very interesting, right? That in a physical building, right, manifesting as out in the world, you would have, as it were, pictures of inner states, right? Or pictures of unconscious forces at play. And that's, of course, entirely expressionist, right? Where the focus is on the inner as it's expressed outwardly. Direct appealing to feeling and will. Most architecture had not appealed to feeling and will. It had appealed to the intellect, right? With its symmetry, for example, right? But instead we have a direct appeal to feeling and will. There's some degree of utopianism. This is, of course, not, it's an anachronistic term, right? It's not an expressionist term, it's our term. New age, right? But this is a sort of utopianism. Transparency, both literal and figural, right? Both literal transparency in the use of glass and figurative transparency in the material disappearing and conveying higher feelings, right? Or conveying a union with higher forces. Organicism, this is not exclusively an expressionist principle, but it's an important expressionist principle. So every part should echo the whole, right? And finally, Gesamtkunstwerk, this is one of those disgusting compound German nouns, right? It means a total work of art, Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art. It was originally coined by the German operatic composer Richard Wagner to describe his operas. But then it got taken over as an idea, quite apart from Wagner, largely by the expressionist painters and of the Blue Rider, right? Of the Blue Rider, chiefly Kandinsky and Franz Marc, who, and of course he's more a musician than a painter, although he's also a painter, Arnold Schoenberg. All three of those gentlemen were in Munich during the pre-war years, and during those years, they were students of Theosophy, which is to say they were students of Rudolf Steiner. And that's a fascinating chapter that I also don't have time to go into, sorry. Okay, so here's the first Goethe Annum, all right? You can see it's unfinished, still boarded up. Quite extraordinary building. So the ground floor is concrete, right? But the second story is all carved. If you can imagine, all of that wood is carved, right? Every bit of it. So really, what you have is a building that's a great sculpture as much as it's a building, right? There, one already sees evidence of the Gesamtkunstwerk, right? So it's a total work of art. It's a building, but it's also a sculpture. And number of extraordinary motifs. We'll say more about them later. And then these cupolas are very extraordinary. There were two cupolas. The cupola is a hemisphere, right? Of different sizes that were conjoined, right? So a large one in the front and a smaller one over the stage behind. And these cupolas were covered with a special kind of slate called Voss slate that Steiner had seen in Norway. And he had transported from Norway at great expense. It's a kind of slate that's got a high mica content. And so when the sun hits it, it really glistens, right? So there's another look at it. As you can imagine, these, you can see just a little bit the second cupola peeking out from the back. These early color photographs are very, very rare and, not very good. But you've got a sense of what the building looked like. There's a whole history, a sort of prehistory of the building in Munich that I don't have time to go into. He wanted to build the building in Munich and went 15 rounds with the local authorities and was eventually turned down. It was very disappointing to him. So this dates from the Munich phase. The outside was to be a street facade. And so it was to be all inward building, right? That you couldn't really see any, this is the Munich first Goethe Annum. You couldn't really see anything of the Goethe Annum on the outside because it was actually shops and things like that. But when you went inside, you got this extraordinary experience. And so the first Goethe Annum was designed from the inside out. This is a wooden model that Steiner made. It looks enormous, but it's actually, it fits on a tabletop. It's just been photographed up close. You see, it's very, very unusual indeed. So this is a vertical section of the Goethe Annum. The first thing to notice about this, right, here are the two cupolas, right? You see a larger and a smaller. This is the west facade that I showed you. The first thing to notice about it is that, now, imagine the continuation of this sphere, right? If you actually continued this sphere, it would touch the earth, right, at the bottom. If you have to imagine it coming down, it would touch the earth, but the continuation of the smaller sphere does not. And this is a quite important bit of symbolism on Steiner's part, because he imagined the Goethe Annum as a place where the spiritual world, which doesn't touch the ground, talks to the physical world, which does, right? So 2 times 7 columns in both the auditorium and on the stage, right? So like the cosmic harmonies of a musical scale, right? And Steiner made much of this musicality of the Goethe Annum. And there's another feature of Gesamtkunstwerk, right? So we've got sculpture, architecture, and now music. You see how I'm working that out. I put this one up here principally because it's a pretty good view of the 2 cupolas, right? It's the 2 cupolas. This would be viewed from the south east, right? I think, yeah. In any case, you can see the 2 cupolas coming out, and then these marvelous hooded, very organic forms, but actually not imitations of any actual organic substance. This is, in this way, he's distinguished from, for example, Gaudi, right? Who put actual turtles and so forth on his buildings. But Steiner wanted the building to feel organic without copying externally any organic forms, right? So this feels very organic, right? But it's not actually a copy of anything specific. Here's a closer view of it. And it looks like the hood over some kinds of plants. And likewise, this motif is, you can kind of get in a tip of the tongue situation with it, where it reminds you of so many of, what is that? But it's not an imitation of it. Is it a dove descending? Is it a 5-petaled flower, right? You're not sure, but that motif runs through the whole building, unifying it, right? Making it organic. This is, I think, a wonderful slide. You can really see how the roof line, for example, is folded like a leaf, right? It's really quite dramatic and dynamic. Yeah. This is a close-up. You can see that some of the elaborate carving that went on. I like this close-up view because it looks kind of like, I don't know, the carved shore of a beach or something like that, after the waves have receded. It's very alive, it's very organic, but it's not the least bit realistic. And I think that's important. So you enter through the west facade, just like in a cathedral, right? And you go up these concrete stairs. Now, these 2 things should jump out at you right away. these extraordinary columns, right? And this thing, I've got another view of it. It'll be more distinct. So what was Steiner intending by making columns that were like this? And what he says is that these are pictures of the actual inner forces at play, right? So it's kind of like a muscular, right? We get this expressionist principle of some of the unconscious being displayed, right? So up here where there's real weight being borne by these pillars, they're thick, right? Down here at the bottom, one has an extraordinary figure. Let's just pick a neutral term for it. And what is it exactly? Again, it doesn't, is it a bird? Well, not exactly. But again, there's something entirely organic about it. And what it suggests to me is the 3 semicircular canals in your ear, right? And it's as though Steiner is saying, come in, enter here. Here's where you'll achieve balance, right? Here's where you'll achieve balance. And again, an entirely inward, right? An entirely non-sensible force is being displayed. In this case, the force of balance. So you come up to the top of the stairs and you get this remarkable door with the cutouts here, which are like the gesture of opening, right? The gesture of opening, come in this door. Gesture of opening, again, kind of invisible will forces being depicted. And here, an extraordinary capital that doesn't display any resemblance to a historical form, right? It's not a Greek capital or a Roman capital, and so forth. Well, what is it that Steiner was trying to display there? Once again, he was trying to display outwardly the inner forces at work, right? So where the loading is very intense, right? It's thick, and where the loading is less, it thins out, and so forth, and so on. So this is now we're in the interior, and we're facing west, right? We're facing the organ loft. And again, look at these wonderful kind of musical notes coming up out of the organ. They're, of course, carved, not actual musical notes. And then it would shoot up this chute. I don't know whether you can see it. And then out into the hall. Very extraordinary. And those are the first 2 columns on each side. So just so that you can see, it really is carved by hand. Here's someone working, carving the interior. The entire surface of the interior was carved. Remarkable. Transparency and transcendence. So in 287, Architecture is Piecework, he says, for example, the harmony of the columns and the motifs, together with everything else in the first Goethe Anum, attempts to provide the soul with means to transcend the appearances of immediate perception, right? So they're forms that don't say, look at me, they say, look through me, right? Look past me. If the soul begins to experience what lives in the forms of our building, then the forms themselves will disappear, and by means of that which is living in the forms, the language of the forms, the soul will find its path outward into the wide spheres of the spiritual world. Then our building shall achieve its purpose. So here you see, exactly that expressionist principle of transparency or transcendence. As for utopianism, Steiner gave, again, this extraordinary cycle of lectures, Architecture's Piecework, which is a kind of guided tour of the first Goethe Annum. And he went, it actually was in response to bickering breaking out among the workers there at the Goethe Annum. Now, this was during the First World War, and there were people from all of the nations that were fighting each other. So there were Russians and Germans and Austrians and British and French and so forth, all there. And every once in a while, you know, this bickering about the war broke out. And he did this as a kind of, I think this lecture cycle is a kind of curative fable, if you know that concept from Waldorf education. So he went through and he said, look, you know, look, here's the sentient soul. That's it. Here's France. That's the rationalist. Here's England. You know, and he went through to show how all of the nations were represented symbolically in the building, and were collaborating towards the great goal of creating this new cultural monument. So he expressly included the nations currently at war, and then he said, wonderful phrase, what we need is not a culture of peace, but an energetic culture of peace, right? We have to make peace, right? Not just allow it to happen, but we have to make it an energetic culture of peace. One of my favorite lines in all of his lectures on architecture. So there's an enormous amount to say, but we won't say it, about the metamorphosis. He says that metamorphosis in evolution is often misunderstood, that people think it goes from simple to complex to more complex, but actually it goes from simple to complex and then back to simple again, right? And here we see that progression. The architrave is the part above the columns that bridges them. And the architrave is, it's like the music that moves between the notes, right? So you've got the carved form of the architrave, and then you can watch them dynamically metamorphose in the architrave into the new form. It's a lot like Goethe's archetypal plant, right? Where one tries to intuit the music between the notes, what's actually moving between them. The bases also undergo metamorphosis. So these are two that are right next to each other. You see here the form hasn't separated, and here it's finally broken loose, right? There are very elaborately painted cupolas, both the large cupola and the small cupola. There's that mysterious motif again, metamorphosed yet another time. There are actually early color photos, they're called Eurochromes, that exist of this. I've included them in the appropriate volume, I think in 289. But we don't have, there's a whole iconography. There's a lot to say about that, but we don't have any time to talk about that. And then the first Goethe Annum burned down on New Year's Eve, 1922 to 1923. And this was a big deal for the locals. They made a postcard out of it. Yeah, could we have the next? Oh, wow, I'm impressed. All right. All right. Boy, I'm just bowled over. Let's talk about Dornach as an integral site, right? So this is Dornach as a utopian community. Now, this is the Goethe Annum, obviously the second Goethe Annum. This is a house that was built for the man who donated the land. It's fascinating, but we don't have time. The Ormeum, also we don't have time for. I'm going to concentrate on the glass house, so the glass house, the heating and cooling plant, and then this place over here, which is called the House de Jager. So this is the glass house, which survived, right? It didn't catch fire, and it stands to this day. Now, it's important as a variation on the theme. First of all, it's important to the utopian Berlin expressionists, this glass in general, and I'll say more about that. But this one is a variation on the theme because the cupolas don't intersect, right? They don't intersect yet. You're not yet arrived at the place where the spiritual world speaks to the physical world, right? But it's like a medieval gatehouse, right? You have to drive by this building on the way up to the Goethe Annum. And it's as though it says, come in here, here's where your longing will be met, right? To experience these two worlds finally together. Here's the bridge, right? There's another view of it. Now, this building actually is not carved. It's actually brick underneath and just shingles over the top, unfortunately. But it looks very similar to the first Goethe Annum. Now, this extraordinary, I don't know whether you've seen this before. Usually people gasp when they go, oh my God. This was the heating and illumination plant, the Heights House, so called. A lot of the local anthroposophists were scandalized by this building, actually. And Steiner said something very clever. He said, so you'd prefer a big red brick chimney, right? Would you rather have a big red brick chimney in the place? And that quieted them. But notice here too, the two cupolas don't intersect, and they'll never intersect, right? This is, of course, the heat rising. So again, the invisible made visible, the inward made outwardly visible. And of course, it's a very, very demonic building. This demonic device is actually an inverted human being, right? You got the threefold thinking, feeling, and willing, and so forth. Turn it around, and you get something resembling the human being. It's a cold building, right? It's very cold. So what was Steiner doing? What Steiner was doing was exporting that part, the hard, the practical, the utopian, the cold, right? He exported it outside the Goethe Annum, right? So it all ended up in this building. The Goethe Annum itself doesn't have electricity generation or heating or anything like that, right? It's not a practical building. Interesting, huh? But icy cold, right? This icy blue doors, etc. Now, on the other side, you remember this is on the right side of the Goethe Annum, is the House de Jager. Jacques de Jager was a Belgian sculptor. And unfortunately, he was wealthy, and he commissioned this building. I don't know whether you can see it very well, but this is north-facing, and that's glass for his atelier. So his atelier was way up here high, and it's kind of pink. It's a pink building. It's not really the color that it is on this slide. He was wealthy. Unfortunately, he died before it could be occupied. And so the extraordinary thing about this is it's an artistic atelier that was never used. And it became something of a museum. You see, now that's closer to the color of the original. See, the practical parts are all hidden behind, and in front you've got this, right? It rises up, right? Like this. So what's going on here, right? And inside, you've got incredible carving. All the details are beautiful. A great German art historian writing about this building said it's like wandering around inside of a fine musical instrument, right? Isn't that funny? So what is this building anyway? And this is my own private theory, but I'm very attached to it. So, smile and nod even if you disagree, please. But the one is, so the heat and illumination plant is what Steiner called the harmonic, right? So that's everything that's of the earth and earthy and drags us down. But there's also a countervailing tendency to fly away from the earth and be impractical, right? And that's what I think he built this building for as well, right? He was too kind to say it publicly. Dioger's widow lived in the house, right? But I think that we've got actually the harmonic and luciferic balanced out in these two buildings. And in fact, in the center of the stage of the Gurtanum was to be a sculpture called The Group, with a representative of humanity, Christ, if you like, balancing out the harmonic below and the luciferic above. And so once again, you see architecture's direct expression of inner spiritual forces. This is so good. Thank you. This is sorry. I've done this lecture many times and I've never had it so good. This is what we now call the second Gurtanum. This was not built during Steiner's lifetime. Steiner died on March the 30th, 1925. But he left a model for this building. He never saw any of it constructed. It was constructed on the same base. Now, this one is interesting because it's designed from the outside in. We don't have any indication from Steiner how the inside should be finished. And this, in fact, became an enormous controversy over the last few decades, where people fought with each other about what the inner form of this building should be. We won't go into that. But trials of fire and water. Now, that, of course, is an old, very, very old motif, spiritual motif. Certainly it's Masonic, but it's much older than that. So the trials of fire and water need to be baked into this building somehow, right? Because of the trials of the burning. Well, the building is made of reinforced concrete, which is to say steel inside of concrete. Steel is hardened by fire, and concrete is hardened by water, right? So the trials of fire and water are there. here, this I have to tell this as a joke on myself. So when I was translating away, I came across this Austrian dialect word, right, where Steiner said, actually the Goethe Annum needs to be a perfect Gugelhupf. And I thought, oh, wow, this must be a really esoteric word. And, I went looking for it. And a Gugelhupf is a bundt cake, right? That's all that it is. It's a cake that's poured into a mold, right? And you turn the mold upside down and you've got the cake, right? Oh, well. But this, of course, is the perfect bundt cake because, in fact, to create a concrete building, you have to build a mold and pour liquid in, and the liquid hardens and so forth. So, and so the second Goethe Annum is, among many other things, a bundt cake, right? Sorry. So here are the first and second Goethe Annum in ground plan in Cutaway. And you can see that the second Goethe Annum is actually very, very much larger. So now the stage is very much more elaborate. There's machinery and so forth. There's office space in the second Goethe Annum now. And so actually the volume doubled. It went from 65, nearly doubled, to 110,000 cubic meters, right? So it's really a monumental building. You can get some sense of just how monumental it is from this shot, right? It really, it's like a great cathedral in a lot of ways. Even though it's made of concrete, it's very alive. And it's alive in a very specific way. Namely, it undergoes a kind of Goethean metamorphosis. So one form of Goethean metamorphosis is the metamorphosis of systole and diastole, right? You know, when you get your blood pressure taken, there are two numbers, the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure, when your heart contracts and when it expands. And so look, for example, at the way in which this first sticks out and then is indented and then sticks out, right? You see? Going all the way up. So it's kind of breathing outward, inward, outward, inward. Again, for hardened concrete, it has a beautiful mobile quality. These strike me as like sails that could be billowing in the wind or something like that, right? Very, very striking. And I think very beautiful. There's another shot that gives you some example. When the shadows at various different times of the day play over the face of this building, they give it always a different look, right? Very, very beautiful. At the sides, you see these here? These are like flying buttresses, but they're not imitations of flying buttresses, but they're somewhat reminiscent of flying buttresses. You know what flying buttresses are? So on a Gothic cathedral, on the outside there are those are called flying buttresses, right? And so it's got two of them. It's got one on each side. And the idea is to evoke that, but not copy it. You know what I mean? There's some people who say, and it might help to squint. If you squint a bit, some people claim they can see the crouching Sphinx, right, in this west facade of the second Goethe Annum. If you don't see it, no matter. So here you get a really good sense of the metamorphosis from the front to the back, right? So it starts small, larger, 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 right? It's really very alive. Here you get a sense of the metamorphosis from the bottom to the top, right? Again, starting small, growing large. There would be a lot to say about these glass windows. They were a kind of stained glass windows. This is very large. This is the equivalent of the rose window in a cathedral. It's in the west facade above the entrance, right? And it's a kind of stained glass, but this is, color is washed out, and I'm sorry about that. But Steiner developed a new technique, actually. So they're monochrome panes of glass. They're all one color. So it's not piecing together lots of different colors like stained glass with lead in between. Monochrome slab. But then using diamond bit, he would dig more or less deeply, right, into this. And where he digs deeply, more light comes through, and where he digs shallowly, less light comes through. And so the result is very, very striking. Okay. The reception of Steiner's architecture. He's long ignored or quickly dismissed by scholars outside of anthroposophical circles. Now, partly, this is a function of the mid-century reception of expressionist architecture as a whole, right? In mid-century, it was the international style, right? Very modern, cubic, ultra rational, ultra utilitarian buildings, right? And this was so dominant a style that, you know, as this happens all the time, right? History is littered with examples of this. They felt, well, you know, this will be the style for the ages now, right? And so, for example, in Siegfried Gideon's classic study, this is a huge book, 897 pages. He gave these as lectures at Harvard. Classic study, Space, Time, and Architecture, the Growth of a New Tradition, so 1938, 1939. Expressionism merits 2 pages, right? 2 pages out of 897 is all. And the little that Gideon has to say about expressionism is cursory and condescending. Faustian outbursts against an inimical world and the cries of outraged humanity cannot create new levels of achievement. The expressionist influence could not perform any useful service for architecture. Men abandoned themselves to romantic mysticism, dreamed of fairy castles to stand on the peak of Monte Rosa. I'll talk about that. Others built concrete towers as flaccid as jellyfish, right? Wow. But the reception of Steiner's architecture really began to shift dramatically with the publication of Dennis Sharp's book, first of all. That's over here, Modern Architecture and Expressionism, with a whole chapter on Steiner. And then Wolfgang Paint, who's in 1973 published Expressionist Architecture, right? Again, with a whole chapter on Steiner. And he's gone on, by the way, to publish a number of books on just Steiner himself, right? He's the great leader, right, of academic art historians of expressionist architecture, so that he's a fan of Steiner really means something. So kudos to Dennis Sharp and Wolfgang Paint for correctly identifying Steiner as an expressionist, contextualizing his work within that within that movement and taking Steiner seriously. In this lecture that I'm giving right now, I offer 3 arguments. It's actually there's method in hiding in the madness. Here are the arguments. Steiner shared and fulfilled the ideals of many contemporaries whom we now call expressionists, right? So Steiner was aware of what other expressionist architects were trying to do, contemporaries of his, right? But not succeeding for various reasons. And he fulfilled many of their ideas. I'll talk about them. Apart from the school of self-identified anthroposophical architects, of which there are many dozens, Steiner clearly influenced or was openly admired by many of the important architects of the 20th century. That should be 3. Gideon et al. Could not have been more wrong. Expressionism has arguably become the mainstream of contemporary architecture. Okay, I've got my work cut out for me. The Berlin radicals, these are contemporaries of Steiner's. Bruno Taut was T-A-U-T, was the leader of this group, and he organized a chain letter that he called the Crystal Chain Letter. There are some 50 various expressionist architects distributed throughout Europe, and he persuaded them once a month to write a sort of manifesto and send it to all of the other 49, right? So you had 50 different manifestos being circulated. Here's an example of something that was written, actually. So this was a kind of architectural manifesto by Wenzel Hablich. Believe it or not, these are sketches of buildings, right? Now, by Hermann Finsterlin. Maybe Gideon was right about flaccid jellyfish and so forth and so on. How can these stand as buildings? Not very practical. Eric Mendelssohn, look at this crazy building. We couldn't possibly build that, except we did, right? This is the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, 1919 through 1921. Now, this is not poured concrete. This is concrete smoothed over a brick underlay. But the curves in this building were so complex that there weren't any builders that knew how to build it. So they had to bring shipwrights from Hamburg, right, who could make curved surfaces and so forth. And this building stands, by the way, until today. And of course, the curves are an homage to Einstein's notion of curved space, right? So there's someone who actually got his radical expressionist architect who actually got someone to build his building. This is very typical Johannes Taut. So he imagined these monumental cathedral-like structures with enormous glass like fans, right? On the facade sticking out like this. Glass, of course, because of its transparency, right? He felt that the transparency of glass would somehow heal all cultural ills, right? When we start building buildings out of glass, right, then we'll have advanced to the situation that we need. Needless to say, nothing like this ever got built. Here's Hans Scharoun. Hans Scharoun was a young man in 1920. He lived a long time, and he actually was the head of architecture in West Berlin at the end of World War II, right? So he's an expressionist who really hit it big. But back then, he also was dreaming of monumental, notice it's glass, right? Glass shining when it's hit by the light. So he participated in this metaphysic of glass. Bruno Taut's Alpine architecture, believe it or not, imagined building monumental glass structures on the top of Alpine mountains, right? So here's Monte Rosa, remember that quote earlier, right? Here's the Luscombe, the Breithorn, the Matterhorn, right? All of these are going to have enormous glass structures that catch the light of the sun and send colored light all over the landscape, and thus will promote general cultural healing. Needless to say, nothing like this ever got built. Here's, for example, what he envisioned for one of those peaks. So an enormous jewel-like red thing up here, and then various other sort of glass tongues that would catch the light and so forth. There's another valley, right? Alpine valley that he imagined would be transformed. Now, Steiner, when he built the first Goethe Anum, I think actually echoed this a bit in two ways. One is, notice this, see this outcropping of rock and observation tower here in the background? So you get a sort of a hint of the mountain, right? A hint of the mountain in this first Goethe Anum. And in fact, the cupola looks a bit like a hill or a mountain, but especially the cupola with the special Nordic slate, right? The Nordic slate that shines, that glistens in the sun. And I think that, you know, at certain times of the day, the sun would strike this cupola and it would be quite blinding, right? And I think that there's a bit of an homage here in Steiner to those expressionist architects. Bruno Taut's Glass House, the Werkbund exhibition in Cologne, this was a building that was built. This is a model of it, but this is the actual building. And of course, it's a celebration of glass. It's entirely made of glass, right? There's the interior. So you've got a glass dome over a kind of a skylight. And that should remind you of Norman Foster's Reichstag. Norman Foster was a very, very brilliant man. And one thing that he did is he studied these Berlin radicals, right? And when he built the huge glass dome on the roof of the Reichstag, he was remembering and recognizing this Bruno Taut and the other Berlin radicals. Now, Taut even imagined lighthouses, right, up in the mountains that would send out powerful beams in all directions at night. And Foster had the same idea, right? So there you see the dome, the glass dome on the roof of the Reichstag with the internal helical stairs that you can climb. And you can actually look down on Parliament through a glass ceiling, right? But he also constructed it in such a, these huge, this kind of mirrored funnel in the center, during the daytime catches the ambient light that comes in and shoots it down into the debating chamber, right? But he built powerful floodlights into the floor, and at night he can turn on those floodlights and it hit the screens, and then it shoots out these light effects in all directions. And of course, it's a celebration of democracy. Isn't that wonderful? And I think, again, that's an homage, let's say, to the Berlin radicals. All right, last set of slides. So the Anthroposophical School, this is the NMB Bank. I think it's changed its name, but you know the building. In Amsterdam by Ton Alberts and Max van Hout, 1982. 10 office towers, reference libraries, conference hall, and more. It's a real complex. This building is so special that they have long waiting lists for people to work in it, right? People just want to work in the building, right? And so there are long waiting lists of people who want to work in this fabulous building. So this is an actual anthroposophical architect. This amazing thing is also by an anthroposophical architect named Gregory Burgess. Do you see in the background here, that's Ayers Rock in Australia, right? And so this is a cultural center for the Uluru people, I'm sorry, the Northern Territory of Australia. And look at the way, first of all, these organic forms, right? How they blend into the landscape. And they're very reminiscent of the first Skirta Anum, aren't they? Quite extraordinary. Imre Makovich, also an anthroposophist, made this very funny quote of the first Skirta Anum by tilting one of the cupolas backwards, right? But this is a gymnasium in Hungary. Wow, right? Wow, talk about expressionist buildings, right? The Graz Kunsthaus, so this is the art museum in Graz. It's like a big tuber, right? And it's all glass. It's all glass, right? Extraordinary, extraordinary. So needless to say, highly expressive, right? This expressivism is coming back. Look at Santiago's Calatravas, Lyon Airport TGV, that's the high-speed train in France. Extraordinary, right? All glass. And it's like, yeah. I don't know whether any of you have ever actually seen this extraordinary Milwaukee Art Museum, but these things at the center, which looks like a boat, doesn't it? These are like big sails on a sail. These actually are motors, and they sort of go down and up, right, very slowly. Very extraordinary. if they had any art to put in the museum, it would be good. But they've sure got the museum for it, though. Wow. Of course, Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum. This is perhaps the iconic late 20th century building. It's this Z-shaped or snaking thing, all metal, totally extraordinary. I could give I've often given whole lectures just on this one building. But well, among other things, well, I'll tell you this much about it. It's a building that's so much about getting you to experience on your skin what it was like to be Jewish, that they opened it empty, and people walked through it empty and were just completely blown away. And they shut it again and went back to the drawing board and had to decide whether they were ever going to put any contents in the museum, right? They were actually going to open it as a bare museum. Extraordinary, talk about inner states and feelings and will and so forth being appealed to. This area right here is, the base is somewhat askew to the vertical columns. So when you walk out into it, you immediately become disoriented and start doing this, right? And so you're actually experiencing what it's like to be a Jew who goes into exile, right? It's the most extraordinary thing. So needless to say, and powerfully expressionist building. Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, right? Again, another iconic building of the late 20th century. I have a neighbor who doesn't like this. He calls it a bus wreck, but I don't think that it is a bus wreck. I think it's very beautiful. And of course, there you've got the building as sculpture, right? The building as sculpture. There's another view of it. Frank Gehry was given this commission. It's in Pariser Platz 1, means it's right next door to the Brandenburg Gate. And so there are very powerful covenants, governing what can be built there. So the outside couldn't look very much like the museum in Bilbao, right? He said, that's okay. I'll make the inside of the building look like that. So two different glass roofs, right? And then beautiful California redwood. And then this extraordinary sculptural, he called it a horse's head, right? Which is where the board of the bank meets, right? I think you'd make good decisions. And the horses, by the way, a very ancient symbol of intelligence, right? So meet inside the horse's head. Of course, what's in an Arab Sydney Opera House, right? Expressionists, right? All the way. Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum is directly inspired by Steiner. Here's this backstory. Wright married a theosophist whose name was Oljvana, and Guggenheim's artistic advisor, was Hillaribe, who was Steiner's student, right? So they said to this guy, copy the forms of the Second Gurtanum, and he did, right? And so Temple of the Spirit, that's how Frank Wright, sorry, I'm getting tired. That's how Wright described his building, this art museum, and it's home, of course, to the great Kandinsky collection, and Steiner was a student of Kandinsky. Le Corbusier, Notre Dame du Haut in Ronchamp, is directly inspired by the Second Goethe Annum. And we know this because we know about Le Corbusier's visit to the Second Goethe Annum. He drove up in a car and was literally speechless for 2 hours, touring the Second Goethe Annum, right? And went away and then created architecture like this, powerfully expressionist. Hans Scharoun, who was a young man, was a member of the radical circle around town. Scharoun called the Second Goethe Annum the most important building of the first half of the 20th century. So Steiner's getting deep respect by this point. His Berlin Philharmonic was clearly influenced by Steiner in many details. And then Canada's own, Douglas Cardinal. I actually gave this lecture somewhere else, and there was a very distinguished gentleman sitting in the audience in three-piece suit, and it was Douglas Cardinal, who had come to my lecture, and he took me aside and he said, "Oh, you perhaps didn't know that I apprenticed with an anthroposophical architect." And he's written the preface to one of those volumes of Steiner that I have. But look at his Museum of the American Indian, very anthroposophical, even more anthroposophical. Look at the intersecting cupolas, right? The Canadian Museum of Civilization. So here's my last slide. In this lecture, I offered 3 arguments. Steiner shared and fulfilled the ideals of many contemporaries, whom we now call expressionists. I hope I've proved that. Apart from the school of self-identified anthroposophical architects, of which there are many dozens, Steiner clearly influenced and was openly admired by many of the most important architects of the 20th century. And third, Gideon et al. Could not have been more wrong. Expressionism, I've showed you the iconic buildings of the late 20th century. They're all expressionists, right? Has arguably become the mainstream of contemporary architecture. If these arguments are true, as I believe they are, then it follows that Rudolf Steiner was a great architectural pioneer. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
Oh, we don't need a microphone. Yeah.
Okay,
You could speak about all the architecture inspired by Rudolf Steiner in the Waldorf schools. He said he's inspired 7 buildings.
Yeah. Especially in Germany, Holland, and Richmond Hill, and the Scandinavian countries, there are lots and lots of buildings built by anthroposophical architects, self-identified anthroposophical architects. And it's true, well, actually, I included a couple of those, Gregory Burgess and Imre Makovich. But indeed, there are 70 or 80, I don't know, that's even an old count. There may be over 100 at this point, of people who actually call themselves anthroposophical architects because they're so deeply influenced by Rudolf Steiner. Yeah, and one could give another evening or 2 or 3 on those. The only reason I didn't do more of those is because in a certain way, you'll understand what I mean when I say this. It's too obvious, right? I mean, the anthroposophical architect is imitating Steiner. I wanted to step away from that and show that even people who don't self-identify as anthroposophical architects are nevertheless influenced by him.
And perhaps how the forms influence consciousness and the ability to think with metamorphical thinking.
Well, of course they do, and when as they should, right? And one hopes that they will. Absolutely, yeah. Hi.
My question was about the metamorphosis of the concept of simple becoming complex
Uh-huh.
and back to simple again. Is that within the chronology of the actual building where there's a time that it's simple and a time it's complex? Or how does that apply?
Yeah, the way that's a really good question. The way that applies is in the sequence of 7 columns, right? You've got 7 big columns in the audience and 7 smaller columns. And so both in the capitals and in the bases, right? There's a metamorphosis that starts simple and then becomes more and more complex, but then surprisingly becomes simple again, right? That's what I was referring to. It's not so much time, except that there's a certain amount of time built into viewing them sequentially. Yeah. Hi. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I haven't read or thought about brutalism specifically, and that's interesting, but I don't have anything to say about that. Let's take Gideon's critique of the expressionists. What he really faults them for is their romanticism, right? So in other words, they dreamt away about possible buildings, but never, thought practically about is it possible to build such a building, right? Let alone get a patron and have it funded and so forth, and so on. And that's where Steiner really stands out. I mean, a lot of these expressionist buildings that Steiner built had tremendously thorny problems, right? Just all kinds of problems. For example, those 2 cupolas of different sizes that had to intersect. Actually, I don't know whether it's a fact, but I've read that the mathematics of that had actually never been worked out, and Steiner worked out the mathematics of those 2 intersecting cupolas of different sizes, right? And the first Goethe Anum especially was a very experimental building. I found it terribly interesting that to catch Steiner saying a few times that if he could start out, he had learned so much, that actually, if you could start over, you do it differently, right? That's very interesting. But I'm sorry, I really can't speak to the brutalism. I don't know. I have to think about that a little. Hi.
I'm wondering, did Steiner think at all about form and function? Like I see that he was.
Oh, yeah.
But what about one of the weaknesses of many architects is they get carried away with the form and they
Right.
don't integrate it very well with the function, how ordinary people will function within that form.
Yeah.
Where was he with that?
Well, he was all in with a building being transparent, not only to spiritual values but to its actual function. Take, for example, that heating and illumination house, right? I mean, really, the building shows very directly everything that it is, right? It is a heating plant, and there's the heat going up, and so forth and so on. And so, you don't want a neo-Romanesque heating plant, right? You want something that's transparent to its actual function. The Fürstgärte Anum had the two cupolas, right, which were actually transparent to their function, right? They
Actually, I think the point I'm trying to get clarity about it, and we have you mentioned one architect who did the Berlin Memorial, who also did the addition to the Royal Ontario Museum here,
yeah, Libeskind.
who, and he actually has boasted about not being concerned
Mhm.
about function, how living human beings feel, and can they do what they're supposed to do within those interesting shapes, and perhaps philosophically meaningful shapes. But to me, you're falling short. I've never visited a Waldorf school, but are they designed so they're comfortable for children?
Oh, absolutely. I've seen a number of Waldorf schools that have special buildings for the preschool kids, and they're all diminutive in size, and they're all round, and they're all cozy, and so forth and so on. No. When a building has been purpose built, right, for Waldorf schools, that's one of the first things is that the person will have in mind. Rooms that are not square, rooms that have skylights, right, is very, very important for the way that people feel in the buildings, right?
He also thought you should design doors that you could tell clearly whether you're supposed to push on them.
Right. Exactly, right? Exactly. Hi.
Hi, you mentioned a building in Hungary. I was wondering, did any of the socialist countries, did they take interest in Steiner's work?
I think that most of those buildings were built after the fall of the wall, right? So Hungary would no longer have been socialist.
But biodynamic farming, I think, was
I don't know a lot about that. I'm hesitant to say. It wouldn't surprise me. But gosh, maybe I shouldn't step in it. I'm out of my depth. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to take issue with your third conclusion. It strikes me when I look around contemporary Toronto that expressionism has only become the mainstream of contemporary architecture in the case of a very, very small class of artist architects, if I can use that term.
Yeah, that's true.
In the face of which the majority of buildings are, I was reminded by this gentleman's comment about brutalist architecture, kind of more
Okay. Um, this is a really good question. When a building is built, right, it's often built with principles of utility and a strict budget and so forth, and the corners have to be square. And, first consideration is the heating and cooling going to work and so forth and so on. And there's very little art that goes into such a building. But when there's a commission that gives an artist free rein, what kind of a building do they build, right? And so in mid-century, artists look at like Mies van der Rohe, right? So, given maybe not unlimited, but, very large budget and so forth, and asked to let loose his artistic creativity, he created, right? But that's not what people with those commissions are doing recently, right? They're reverting to something much more openly expressionist. So, yes, of course you're right, but we're talking about really a different species of building, a building more where the vision, right, the vision of the architect is allowed to enter in. My son is an architect, and so this complaint about never being allowed to engage his fantasy, he's just building one utilitarian building after another, is very familiar, sadly. Hi.
Taking from all you've learned about Steiner's work over the years, what kind of messages or things do you feel he would share if he was alive today, looking out over the world today?
Oh, wow. What a big question. What a delicious question. Well, okay. He would lament the terrible backsliding into nationalism that's taking place in many, many countries, right? I think that he would be interested to see that materialism has, let's say, been qualified. So we actually live in a less materialistic culture, right? We may live in a very materialistic, sort of consumer paradise and so forth. But, say the advanced science and so forth is actually less materialistic than it was in Steiner's day. He would applaud that, but he would still encourage people very, very strongly to overcome these residues of materialism. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but Steiner was a globalist, and he would be all in on globalism. With all kinds of modifications and so forth. But he felt that the economy in particular was a global, and that erecting artificial tariffs and barriers and so forth was an inherently destructive phenomenon. I mean, if you think about it, from one perspective, what is globalism? It's, moving production to where labor is cheapest. But, from the other perspective, it's raising the wages of labor in the countries that need it most to be raised. And that liberates the other parts of the world to make more complex kinds of products, right? That is fundamentally, I think, sound. I think he'd say yes to that. He'd be pleasantly surprised at the success of the Waldorf schools. I don't think that he was so hopeful. You have to remember that the Waldorf school was founded at, arguably the least opportune moment that one could found a school, right? That the economy had collapsed, the government had collapsed, right? The Kaiser had gone into exile. There were competing armies in the streets fighting. The socialists and the communists declared they had formed a government on the same day from different parts, in different parts of Berlin, right? It was total chaos. And, you know, soon the inflation would come and it would take a whole wheelbarrow of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. I think that Steiner put on a brave face, but he didn't have much hope for the Waldorf School. And they've survived magnificently. I think he'd be pleased that biodynamic agriculture is starting to spread. I think he'd actually have a lot to say about that biodynamics. You know, the biodynamic movement is actually founded on just one course of lectures that Steiner gave in the last year of his life. Just one course, right? And all of it is grown out of just that. So I think he'd have a lot to say about biodynamics. Gosh, sorry, I'm stuck a little bit, but
Maybe a little tired. I think you can tell that Dr. Amrine could answer any question you can imagine on Steiner, or we could go on for many hours. I'd like to.
I
give you
I
a-
appreciated that question. I thought it was a good one.
I think it's time for us to go on and see what's available and to immediately to thank Dr. Amrine very much for this
You're welcome.
Amazing lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. On behalf of the Toronto chapter of the Anthroposophical Society of Canada, we'd like to thank you.
What? Should I open it?
Take a peek. I think you'll be.
Oh, yes. Yes. It's the, what is it? What is it called?
A hedron. It's an interactive desktop hedron with chalk draw.
Okay. You know, thank you I'm so glad to have this. Thank you so much. You know, do you know Durer's engraving called Melancholia? It's got this in it. Not with that, right? But it's got one of these. Oh, really? I'm so happy to get this. Thank you so much. Yeah, all right.